From game day to signing day, breaking down every snap and all the news on Alabama's top football recruits. It's time for Crimson and Blue Chips with your host, John Garcia Jr.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome in to a Friday edition of Crimson and Blue Chips. Happy Friday to you. A Football Friday edition of Crimson and Blue Chips is going to kick off here shortly. I'm your host, John Garcia Jr. What we have planned for you today is very simple, very straightforward, almost a classic edition of our podcast, entering year 4 next month. And we're going to salute the guy who really put it in our minds 4 years ago to start discussing Alabama football and recruiting in podcast form. He also happens to cover the Ole Miss Rebels, so a perfect time to bring back Ben Garrett from the Ole Miss Spirit. He's going to break it down for us. How terrible is this Ole Miss defense? How good is this Ole Miss offense? And what, if anything, changes when you go from playing Southern Illinois to a certain number 1 team in the United States of America? So we're going to run through the Rebels and this matchup for the SEC opener for each team. And then we're going to get to you guys. Q&A. We're very backed up on Q&A. Got a lot of great digital submissions on Twitter, Gmail, etc. So we're going to spend a lot of time on Q&A to wrap up the show and the week of programming right here at hashtag CABC. Football's here. The SEC play is here, baby. Let's get into it. Every time Alabama and Ole Miss tangle, I need to catch up. I need an education on the Rebels, and there's no better guy, especially in this format, to do so. To help us out than Ben Garrett from the Ole Miss 24/7 site, the Ole Miss Spirit, the market leader there. Ben, you got me into this business, so it's your fault if you don't want to stay on this interview for 30 minutes, but we'll condense it and we'll go quickly. What should we know about Ole Miss?
That's a great question. First and foremost, how are you doing, buddy? It's been a while. You good?
I'm doing well. The podcast has evolved a little bit, we think, but they're still tolerating me, so all is well.
Well, you're the best. You're the best in the business, man. I mean, I would assume that you're doing well. But, yeah, Ole Miss is an interesting case study on how good an offense can be and how bad a defense can be in return. Ole Miss has a 9-win offense. Really, it's one of the most loaded up, weaponized offenses Ole Miss has ever had in its history. But defensively, they're every bit as bad as their offense is good right now. They were already a tough defense to begin with as far as giving up yards and points. And I mean that in the most negative way possible. Not tough as in, tough and being able to hold up against offenses. But they were already struggling. In the previous 2 years, they're among the nation's worst in stopping the run. And then they lose Marquise Haynes, Breland Speaks, and DeMarcus Gates, their 3 top defensive players from last year's team, with no obvious candidates to replace them. Texas Tech, you thought you saw some positive signs. They hold Texas Tech to 27 points, but really when you started for Texas Tech, went out in the second half of the series. So you had a quarterback who was in high school a few months prior out there trying to learn on the fly as the starting quarterback for Texas Tech. But it all came apart in the first half against Southern Illinois. I mean, they gave up touchdowns on 5 of 6 first half possessions. I know in the second half they outscored Southern Illinois 41-3, aided by 2 defensive touchdowns, but there were still big plays to be made for Southern Illinois on the offensive end. They still averaged 5 yards per carry. You still saw a number of wide receivers and leaked out running backs and tight ends and fullbacks running free down the field. But Southern Illinois did not have the firepower to kind of withstand the Ole Miss's offensive attack or to keep going offensively. They're just as you would expect from a Missouri Valley Conference school. So right now, Ole Miss doesn't know what it is defensively. You always hear those catchwords from coaches. Maybe it's focus, maybe it's eye discipline, maybe it's identity. Ole Miss doesn't have any clue what it wants to be right now defensively. And until it finds that out, it's basically asking that its offense be completely perfect every single Saturday. And they were perfect against Southern Illinois. Will they be perfect against Alabama? No team can be perfect against Alabama. So defensively, either they're going to have to put up or shut up. It's nut cutting time on Saturday, or they're just going to have to accept the fact that this is their lot in life now, to where they're effectively Texas Tech from the Michael Crabtree years, where they had all this offense and no defense. And you're just waiting to see that defense show some semblance of an ability to stop anyone and they haven't been able to do it. And it's not just players, because Ole Miss does have some talent deficiencies on defense, but it's also scheme. It has to be. When you look out there, Southern Illinois has 6 different plays, if not more, of guys running free, wide open down the field for 30, 40 yards. That's not just a player issue. That's a scheme issue, too. So I think all involved are collectively trying to figure out a way to make this even remotely competent in order to help out an offense that is good enough to compete with any team that plays every single Saturday. And you'll see that when Ole Miss and Alabama play. Alabama's loaded up defensively. They are every single year. But Jordan Tiamu's playing at an extraordinarily high level. A.J. Brown is on pace for an historic season as far as Ole Miss receiving records are concerned. He's has already been put as an early candidate potentially for Heisman consideration. I know that's far-fetched, but when you look at the numbers, A.J. Brown is, without question, the most productive wide receiver in all of college football for the last 2 years. So there's so much going well for Ole Miss on one side of the ball and so much going wrong for it on the other side.
Now, you mentioned the defensive lapses, guys running free. Obviously, Southern Illinois was trailing a lot of that game, so they were going to air it out as much as they could. Did they try to run the ball at all, Ben? Did Ole Miss have trouble stopping the run before all those guys started running free in the passing game?
No, they were running the ball well even before Southern Illinois started throwing it. See, Ole Miss's offense actually started the game with a 3-and-out, and SIU turned around and drove the field with a touchdown. And it was a mix of run and pass, and you had gashes in the run game and also deep passes where guys were running wide open and free release tight ends or fullbacks or running backs. It was really bad. And I think that's the biggest concern. You don't know what Ole Miss defensively does well, if there's one area that they even do one thing well. And until they show that they have some semblance of an ability to stop something of an opponent's offense, then I think they are what they are. And that's the biggest concern. Their defensive line was expected to be the first line of defense. It was expected to be the group that, while the linebackers were figuring some things out, or maybe they were breaking in some newcomers here and there, the defensive line, especially the interior, they could rely on, because you have accomplished players like Josiah Coatney and Benito Jones. And yet you just haven't seen much, if any, consistent pressure from the defensive line, much, if any, resistance from the defensive line, an inability to penetrate and get to the backfield. And that was even against SIU. And that's what's most disconcerting if you're an Ole Miss fan, if you're watching this team play. If you couldn't generate pass rush or generate any type of interior pressure or run fits against SIU, are you expected to do it against Alabama? I think if Ole Miss could field even just an average defense, its offense could win 8 games. I truly believe that, if not 9 wins. But defensively, you just don't know what you have. And with Alabama, this could be a really fun game if its defense suddenly did a turn, a 180-degree turn and figured something out and was able to, stop Tua Tagovailoa and Judy and all those other monster skill players that Alabama has. But they haven't done it through 2 games. So until they do, you have to go in here expecting that Ole Miss wants this to be a track meet, that its offense is damn near perfect to get. And if it is, maybe they'll make it fun. But otherwise, they just don't have the horses to keep up.
My last 2 things on the defense. One, what are they saying? What are the players saying? What are the coaches saying about those lapses? And 2, if you have nothing to lose, like Ole Miss does in this game, especially on that side of the football, do you not just kind of go crazy and get blitz happy and start really rolling the dice if your base stuff and your game planning isn't working anyway? Is there just like a kamikaze, approaching Alabama? How would you approach it, I guess?
I would take a lot of chances. My biggest issue I had was after the game was over, Wesley McGriff, the defensive coordinator, and Matt Luke, head coach, both came out and said it wasn't a scheme issue. It was about eye discipline and focus and this, that, and the other. And I just didn't like that. I felt that was a way of deferring blame to simply the players, when all involved here should acknowledge some semblance of culpability. When you talk about eye discipline, does Wesley McGriff, and that being a problem with the players, well, that's also a coaching issue.
Right.
If it's eye discipline, that's something that's coachable. So you can't just pin it on the players. Everyone involved has, played a part in this defense being so bad. So that's what they were saying, and that's something I just didn't agree with. But I think most assuredly you're going to see a lot of blitzes. You're going to see, I think, some personnel tweaks, maybe not new starters or anything, but certain guys maybe moving up because of their ability to attack the ball, like a Keydron Smith, a true freshman. When he got in there, he flashed. Now he doesn't know what the hell he's doing, but at least he'll attack the ball when it's in the air. I think so much of what Ole Miss is defensively right now is this waiting for something to happen, waiting for something better, rather than going creating. Nick Saban defenses are a good example of going out and creating big plays, creating those big moments, those game-turning moments. It's this ability to not only get to the passer, but you have aggressive play in the secondary, and their linebackers can match up one-on-one, and they take chances. When you're just waiting back for something not to go wrong, well, guess what? 9 times out of 10, something's probably going to go wrong.
All right, getting to the Ole Miss offense, which is really what I wanted to talk about most today. Just a couple of questions. One, how do you pronounce the quarterback's name one more time?
Jordan Ta'amu.
Ta'amu.
Nah,
Okay.
I fucked that up. Let's start that over.
That would be great to leave in.
Yeah.
All right. 2 questions on the offense, and we'll wrap it up here ahead of Saturday's evening's matchup. The quarterback, Hawaiian versus Hawaiian, Ole Miss Bama. Who would have ever thought that? And the pronunciation of Tengo Vailoa has been a big deal. So flipping it to Ole Miss, what is the correct pronunciations of Jordan's last name?
Jordan Ta'amu.
Ta'amu. Okay, so there you go, Bama fans.
But here's the thing. I think that's right, but I also thought Ta'amu was right, so I could be wrong. If you say Jordan Ta'amu, though, it's generally accepted that that's correct, so that's what I go with.
Okay, because it's T-A-A, right? T-A apostrophe A?
Yeah, and he's such a good quarterback. And here's something that's so much fun to talk about. Everyone knows that Ole Miss dealt with the NCAA issues for 5 years, and it cost them Shea Patterson, right? Well, at least on the surface, it seemed that way. But the way Jordan played and how well he ran Phil Longo's offense, when Shea went down with an injury, it was not a guarantee that Shea, should he have returned to Ole Miss, was just going to be the number 1 starter again.
Wow.
There was going to be a real quarterback competition, and you've seen that again. I mean, look at the pace in which Jordan Ta'amu – look, I've already changed his last name pronunciation.
But
look at the way Jordan – I know. Jordan Ta'amu, look at the production he's put up in 2 games. I mean, it's historic production. And he's never going to be able to jump Eli Manning, Chad Kelly, Archie Manning, and probably Bo Wallace as far as production in his Ole Miss career, just simply because he's not going to have enough time. But if he continues on this pace, he most certainly will be included in the top 5 and could jump Bo as far as what he accomplishes numbers-wise. And that's saying something for a player that didn't get into games until late October, early November. And I think it's a testament to him and his ability to buy into this offense and the perfect fit for an offense in Phil Longo that suits his talent. Because if you watch him, his deep throw accuracy is among the best in college football. And he's putting ball placement on the sidelines to one-on-one matchups with DeMarcus Lodge or Braylon Sanders, whoever it is. He could fit it in there as good as anybody. So I think that's what makes this offense go, is the big plays. And that's what they'll try to get against Alabama. It's going to be harder. It's not SIU. It's not Texas Tech. But that's what Ole Miss's biggest weapon is offensively, are those huge chunk plays. And they can attack you in a number of ways. You want to bracket coverage A.J. Brown? Okay, they're going to throw it one-on-one to DK Metcalf. Oh, you want to shut down DK Metcalf and maybe roll something over to A.J. Brown? Well, they got a running back in Scotty Phillips through the first 2 games of the season. He's on pace for well over 1,000 yards. Or they have another wide receiver, DeMarcus Lodge, that had he gone anywhere else would be the number 1 option on that team right now, maybe except for Alabama. But even then, he could make a case. That's how accomplished they are at wide receiver. And it all starts, though, with the trigger man. That's Jordan Ta'amu, because he can throw the ball and put it wherever he wants to, especially deep balls.
You mentioned Scotty Phillips. This is my last offensive question. He's, I think, what makes it different this year. I think those teams that beat Bama back-to-back, you had the mobile enough quarterback, I guess. Obviously, big, strong wide receivers who can make plays one-on-one, 50-50 balls. But it felt like Ole Miss never really commanded running game respect and wanted to establish it. And Scotty Phillips has great running back build. He's quick, he's fast, he's elusive. He's a JC kid, so probably a chip on his shoulder as well. What makes him different, and what makes his presence different in that Ole Miss attack?
See, I disagree with you, because Jordan Wilkins was the perfect running back for this offense. I mean, that was a player that had only the 5th 1,000-yard rushing season in Ole Miss history last year. And
let me say Phillips seems like the best running back in this run. That's what I meant. And that they would, if there's a guy you force feed it to of all these backs the last few years, he's the guy. That's what I meant.
Well, I still disagree with you, but I see your point. But Scotty Phillips does fit perfectly for what they needed. They needed a guy who could step in and replace Jordan Wilkins immediately. Jordan Wilkins lost a season of eligibility, not because he was ineligible on his own doing. It was because of an administrative error, and he lost his entire junior season. Otherwise, we'd be talking about how good Jordan Wilkins was. But what changed was when Ole Miss beat Alabama in 2014 and 2015, you're right. They had Jalen Walton, a mix of Jordan Wilkins, who still was banged up. You covered him in recruiting. He had the devastating knee injury his senior year of high school. He was Mr. Tennessee football, was committed to Auburn originally, ended up at Ole Miss, and they traded Peyton Barton at Ole Miss to Auburn for effectively Jordan Wilkins. He wasn't quite that yet. So back then, you're right. Their offense, their running game was different, and Hugh Freeze was calling the shots with Dan Warner as his offensive coordinator mixing in as well. Now, Phil Longo and Matt Luke, it's a perfect blend. Phil Longo is a true air raid disciple. He's from the Mike Leach tree, Cliff Kingsbury, you name it. While Matt Luke is more of a believer in the power type of running game, but it's meshed beautifully. It's like an air raid power variation that they run, and Scotty Phillips does fit that type of offense better than, without a doubt, those teams from 2014, 2015, but arguably better than Jordan Wilkins in terms of what they want to do. Now, the question is, can they establish a run against Alabama? And I say that because of this. And against Texas Tech, and you can't do this, but let's do it for the sake of this podcast. Against Texas Tech, he had runs of over 60 yards, 40 yards, and 30 yards. If you take those three busts away, those three breakaway runs, and you can't because that's a part of it, but if you did take those away, on every other run, they only average a little over 3 yards per carry. So my question is, Alabama is very seldomly, if ever, going to give you a true huge bust run. So if you don't get that, can you still sustain drives and make the average better than 4 yards per carry, 4.5 yards per carry? Because if you can, it's going to be hard to do anything. If you can, you'll hang in and you'll keep your defense from going out there and embarrassing itself down in and down out. So I think Scotty's a really good running back for what they do now. He's a one-cut runner. He sees things well. He doesn't have a top-end speed that's ideal, but his vision is tremendous, and his one-cut ability to put his foot in the ground, find the hole, and go is what makes him so valuable. And there's no doubt that he is the workhorse back for Ole Miss. I mean, he's the clear-cut number one. The number two is so far number two that it's not even worth talking about. He fits this offense. He's what they need. And arguably, in my opinion, one of the most can't have him get hurt players on this roster, save for Jordan Ta'amu. And because they could lose A.J. Brown, as crazy as that sounds, and still be able to field a competent receiving unit because you have two other NFL players in DeMarcus Lodge and DK Metcalf, as well as an emerging talent in Braylon Sanders. You can't lose Jordan Ta'amu because the backup is Matt Corral, and he's a true freshman. And Scotty Phillips goes down, then you got what? Isaiah Woolard could be something someday, but he's a true freshman. Eric Swinney's had 2 devastating knee injuries. Devon Penniman's still on the sideline. Scotty Phillips has to stay healthy. Fortunately for him, he's got an offensive line that is one of the strongest Ole Miss has ever fielded, and that offensive line can go toe-to-toe with any offensive line in the country, including Alabama's, as far as depth and talent is concerned, led by Greg Little, and you remember Greg Little very well. He's one of the best left tackles in football, and they keep Scotty Phillips pretty clean and open holes for him that allow him to get chunk yards at a moment's notice. The question is, will Alabama allow those, and if they don't, can you sustain a drive?
I'm pumped up, man. I'm ready to go now. You got you're going as fast as the Ole Miss offense. I'm just ready for Saturday night now.
Well, Alabama's going to win, so calm down.
Well, I was going to get to a prediction. I mean, you know how.
Well, I'm not giving you a prediction, man. I'm not doing it.
Well, you already said Alabama's going to win, so
well,
that's published.
Alabama more than Ole Miss. That's going to happen. I mean, Ole Miss does not defensively have the horses, or have shown no ability so far to slow down Alabama. Alabama under Nick Saban in a Nick Saban offense, any Nick Saban offense, never has he fielded an offense that has scored 50-plus points in 3 straight games. I feel pretty confident saying they're going to score 50 against Ole Miss right now.
What is the over-under right now, first of all? Total.
Oh, God. I mean,
is that at 100?
Ole Miss has been so good offensively that, I mean, I think that they believe they can hang 50 on anybody. But I'd like to see it against Alabama because, I mean, Jordan Ta'amu hasn't faced an Alabama yet in his career. You know, he hasn't faced that caliber of team yet in his career. So I would like to see what he does against this team. But if he goes out and performs again, there's no more denying that this offense is as good as everyone thinks it is. But will it be enough? Because at this point, they have to be perfect on every single drive to compensate for their defense. And no offense in college football can be perfect, even though Tua is 10 for 10 on third down. But let's not get into that.
Well, yeah, we'll see. We'll see. It seems like it's a pretty simple matchup, but obviously you got to go do it. And it's, it's at Oxford. It's at night, national television audience.
And Ole
You
Miss is
never
going
know.
to score. If
Yeah.
it becomes a track meet, then it becomes really fun.
Right.
And while Ole Miss probably doesn't have the horses to finish it, if it does become a track meet, it could be pretty fun. If it doesn't, then, who knows?
Scary wide receivers. You mentioned the 4 guys. And think about this, Bama fans listening. 2 really, 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 really good receivers left that Ole Miss roster and are starring elsewhere now. Am I right?
Yeah, and
With
they
Van
were the
Jefferson
Trey Nixon.
and Trey Nixon down at UCF catching passes from Milton. So, yeah.
Their top 3 options have always been AJ, DK, and DeMarcus. Van had fallen behind Braylon Sanders from last year. And so he leaves. And everyone can say, it's the NCAA. Well, it's also he saw the writing on the wall. So Van leaves. Trey was buried on the depth chart. He just couldn't see the field, and he wanted to go back home. Really what hit him for the NCAA stuff was, one, Shea Patterson. And, maybe the few other guys. But, really, the wide receivers, no, man. They just when you have that
Ridiculous.
3-headed monster in front of them, there's no seeing the light. If you can go be a star wide receiver somewhere else, and hey, Florida lost to Kentucky, so best of luck to Van Jefferson.
There you go. Ben Garrett, the guy who got me on this side of the business. Sir, we appreciate you. Enjoy Saturday night, and thanks for all the great insight as always.
Always, my friend. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you to Ben Garrett for rejoining Crimson and Blue Chips. It had been a while, but Bama-Ole Miss, just a natural time to bring him back, and you see where we enjoy getting him on the podcast. He fires us up. He tells it like it is. He's not a homer, which we appreciate on this program. We like to think that we are not the homer brand of Alabama podcast. So, Ben, we appreciate you for staying in our lane and giving us the lowdown on the Rebels. Again, Alabama-Ole Miss, Saturday evening in Oxford. So, obviously, a lot to be on the line there for either side. Before we jump to Q&A fully, I do want to shine some light on a poll that we actually asked earlier this week. We're very curious as to the Bama fan pulse, the pulse of Alabama Crimson Tide Nation, with a certain topic that has been somewhat polarizing to this point. We're curious about the MVP so far through a couple of games for Alabama, and this is excluding quarterbacks, of course, because every reply just said Tua. We think it's deeper than that, so we excluded quarterbacks from the discussion just for the sake of who Bama fans thought was the most impressive performer through a couple of weeks ahead of SEC play. 47 votes came in, so we appreciate it. We didn't really promote it or re-promote it very much, but we were just curious as to our loyal core, our group there, who they thought were the MVP. And there were 4 choices. I thought they were pretty straightforward. Quinnen Williams, Deontay Thompson, Jonah Williams, and Jerry Jeudy. And it was close for a while, but Quinnen Williams actually came out on top, 43% of the vote, followed by Deontay Thompson with 36% of the vote. 12% of the vote went to Jerry Jeudy, and 9% went to Jonah Williams. Surprising. Quinnen was my vote. Quinnen was the guy who I thought has been the best player on the field for Alabama, aside from the quarterbacks, again, through a couple of games. But we were just curious to see, I should say, what the fans thought. And Quinnen did edge out Deontay Thompson. But I think those 2 guys running away with the majority of the votes, I think tells a different story, tells an important story in regards to Alabama football through 2 games. It means these defenders are coming around. It means these defenders are stepping up. It means these defenders are assimilating to where they need to be at this point in time. And that was part of the reason why I wanted to put it out there. I wanted to see how Alabama fans were perceiving these 2 guys in particular. Jonah Williams will be a case for MVP no matter where he is, no matter what the season looks like, no matter how the games go. He's going to be a candidate more times than not. Jerry Jeudy, flashing, 4 touchdowns in 2 games, speaks for itself among that star-studded wide receiver core. But when you go to defense, and when you got a guy dominating on the front end, and a guy flashing and playing consistent football on the back end, now all of a sudden you have the foundation for continued success. All year, what were the questions, or all offseason, I should say, what were the questions for Alabama? Who was going to replace all of these departed secondary members, and who was going to step up front in that front seven aside from Raekwon Davis, I should say, aside from the guy who we expect to be great. And Quinnen Williams not only has been great, but has outshined Raekwon in each of these first two games. So I wanted to see just how in tune the Bama fans were. And again, you guys always deliver there. Very much in tune, very on top of it, paying close attention, and giving these two defenders their due during their most extended run of starting playing time that they've had in their career. So thanks for all who voted. We would encourage you to always just check back at Crimson and Blue Chips, at CABC Pod on Twitter. We have Twitter polls, a lot of discussions, a lot of non-podcast items to get to, and obviously sometimes they do end up making the podcast itself. But it is time for Q&A. It is time to get your guys and gals on the very latest with Alabama football and recruiting. We'll stay on Twitter for the majority of it. We do have one email question that we'll get to wrap up the programming. Rafael Monroy is going to kick us off. Hope all is well. I think it's time to unleash Tua. Jalen has been great, and all Bama fans are thankful for him. He is an all-time great. But it's time Tua gives us the best chance to win. Time for Tua to take over full-time. Your take on this? Roll Tide Roll from Long Island, New York. Rafael, I see where you're going with this. I see where you're going with the question. I see where you're going with your own thought process. Look, it's different when Tua's in there. I don't think anybody can debate that fact. But, and this is a big old but here, Nick Saban has been so cautious, overprotective, selective, and just careful with how he deals with Jalen Hurts, whether it's on the field, whether it's through verbal communication, through the media. Every element of the Jalen Hurts end of the conversation has been extremely calculated by Nick, by the coaching staff, and it has led into a lot of playing time and near a 50-50 split with the aforementioned Tua Tagovailoa. Now, what would make that change? Is it a close game? Is it a game where Bama's trailing? Is it a game where Jalen Hurts isn't performing? Because I think it would take something like that to get Nick to pull the plug on the 50-50, the theoretical 50-50 split. Because all indication to this point is going to be Tua's first, Tua's the starter. He's going to get a few drives to get his feet wet, get settled in, get into a rhythm, and then Jalen's going to get that same opportunity. Now, again, each of the first two games has gone Alabama's way in an overwhelming fashion. Tua has led a bunch of scoring drives and helped Alabama get out to strong leads in week 1 and week 2. So I think if that continues, if Bama does this again Saturday, Rafael, and gets out to another strong lead behind the arm and with Tua at the helm, then I think you see the same thing we've seen. I think Jalen Hurts comes back in. He gets his chance, three or four straight drives to get into a rhythm and see where he's at in the game. Now, I think where the biggest change could potentially come in the coming weeks, meaning SEC play, Ole Miss, A&M, etc., I think where the biggest change could come is the second half. One, Tua hasn't had to play much in either second half. So that obviously could change if the games are a little bit tighter. But two, we've seen Nick go from quarterback 2 to QB3 with Mac Jones in each of these first two games. So there is where I expect to see some change as to where even if Tua begins to get the lion's share by a wide margin of these reps, then Jalen gets the remainder of those. So I don't think your scenario of Jalen Hurts being cut out completely is something that Nick is willing to throw out there, at least right now. Again, We haven't seen a game close. We haven't seen a game dicey. Bama hasn't had to come back from anything. I think I know they've had the lead or been tied for all 120 minutes so far of the season. So what does Nick do if and when that changes? That will be question one. And question two is, if it's back and forth, do you still give the other guys as much run? I don't know. At Bill Big D chiming in with a question. Saw Mays, the O lineman from Georgia, run block quite well on Saturday. Why, after he decommitted from UT and called Bama, did we not show any real interest? Did we think we had NPF locked up? Going back to last cycle, it's a little bit fuzzy for me, to be honest, Bill. I'm not going to defend Bama if that was the case. If they did indeed not show interest and not take that call, I would be surprised. That class last year was a smaller group. That class last year was looking for tackles for the most part, especially there at the end. Now, nobody felt excellent about Nicholas Petit-Fier, who ended up at Ohio State. Nobody did. Ohio State felt comfortable but not great. And everybody else in the conversation just felt okay, whether it was Florida, Alabama, etc., if memory serves. So I don't think it's in Bama's DNA, if they don't feel great about a kid, to shut out all other options. Even if they do feel great about a kid, typically speaking, Bama's still going to recruit guys, keep guys warm, and keep guys in the loop. So I don't think that was the case verbatim. Hey, Cade Mays, blue chip O lineman, decommits from Tennessee, calls Alabama, and Alabama says no thanks. I have a hard time believing that's how it went down. Now, Cade was not a kid that I talked to very much. Cade was not a kid I talked about very much. But as soon as he decommitted from Tennessee, the conversation shifted to Clemson and Georgia. So it never really jumped back to Bama. I don't think Bama got a visit or anything like that. So I don't know if this was something that they were reacting to or something that that they just missed out on. I'm not sure 100%. But Cade Mays is a good player. Bama offered him very early in the recruiting process. It knew just how good he was, and I would imagine pushed to some degree to at least get him back on campus. To my recollection, it never materialized, and he ended up at Georgia, who signed a gaudy offensive line class. So I think that one just played out the way it did. I don't know who's to blame or anything or who's at fault, but it kind of just played out that way, and UGA certainly benefited. But Bill, you've got some insight I don't have here. Did Bama push? I'm not sure. I would imagine they did, at least to some degree, at least initially. Spence at SC3 Management chimes in. Do you think Nick would potentially replace Savion Smith with Patrick Surtain Jr. if he continues to be high risk, high reward as he continues to develop and get reps? That's a good question, Spence. I think when it comes to pure talent, Savion is one of your top 3 corners, and he's going to see the field regardless. Now, in terms of where he plays, how prominently he plays as the season progresses, that could be something up for debate. Look, Patrick Surtain has done very well with his positioning. He's done very well with his assignments, as far as we can tell, through his first 2 collegiate games. But there's no doubt that Savion Smith gives you a lot more or a lot less wiggle room in terms of making the right call versus taking the right risk. There's an element of Nick Saban that likes that. I think we sometimes fall into the trap of thinking, okay, typically speaking, and over the long haul of Nick Saban's career, he's been conservative on offense. But Nick is not conservative on defense, and I think that is a bit of a misconception. That is a natural one to make because we see what Alabama's offenses of the past look like. But he doesn't do that on defense. So the risk of Savion Smith, the gambling nature of his game, I don't think bothers Nick as much as most of us think. Yours truly included. I'm not saying I don't put Nick in the conservative box just as much as the next person. But when you think about it and you go deeper, which I have since that last game, Nick likes to roll the dice. Nick likes to put pressure on guys. And when you have a cornerback who has ball skills and that mentality to attack the football almost at all costs. I say almost because he's not jumping every single play that he's in there, He's going to jump more than he does it, but he's not only going for the football. He's playing his assignment. He's making tackles. He's doing his job. But again, compared to the other corners on the roster, he's going to be more high risk, high reward. But I don't want to paint it as if he is just diving at every ball, abandoning all responsibility, leverage to make a play every single time. He'll do it a couple times a game, but not every single time. So I think that's a bit of a misconception, not only with him, but with what Nick Saban likes. Nick is okay with that. Nick wants to take risks to some degree. So I do think the continued evolution and the continued experience of Patrick Surtain will help move around guys. We've already seen Pat play outside, Trevon Diggs slide inside because he's more experienced, more versatile. So I think as Pat gets experienced and as Pat gets comfortable, you could see more potential movement at the cornerback position. But right now it looks like Diggs is the guy who's going to move around much more than Savion Smith. But we'll see. We'll see if there's a game where high risk, high reward will be exposed. It will be Saturday against A.J. Brown, against DK Metcalf, against these other receivers. Ole Miss has 4 really good ones and a good running back. So if it's going to happen to any of the top 4 corners, it's going to be on Saturday. Again, I think this is the top quarterback, wide receiver combination that Alabama is going to deal with all season long. All season long. So if any of these corners are going to look exposed and have the chance to redeem themselves in the same game, it will be Saturday evening in Oxford, Mississippi. Carl Lenzner jumping in with a couple of questions. Good morning, John. With Alabama playing Ole Miss this week, I thought it would be a good time to ask this question. This is a good one from Carl. Greg Little and Jonah Williams were in the same recruiting class. Little was rated a little ahead of Jonah Williams at the time, if you remember. Alabama almost got Little also. So right now, who's the better player and why? And if you were an NFL general manager, dream job, who would you pick and why? Good question from Carl. Good question. Greg Little is a very athletic, lean offensive tackle who projects as a classic blindside protector in the NFL. I think he has room to grow, technically speaking, and I still think Greg has room to grow physically speaking. Saw him at the opening finals, just, in there helping coach at the end of June without pads on or anything like that. He's still got some frame to fill out on, and that is not typically the case for blue chip offensive linemen finishing or wrapping up their collegiate career. So I think the upside of Greg Little is still somewhat unknown. We don't know how high of a ceiling he may have physically because he could still crack on 25 solid pounds. But again, how does that factor into his movement skill? How does that factor into his athleticism? How does that factor into his strength even? Can his strength boom up that much to where he is going to be the top offensive tackle taken in this draft? So I think speaking of high risk, high reward, I think there's more fluctuation with Greg Little than with Jonah Williams. I think with Jonah Williams, you know what you're getting. If you're an NFL GM, if I'm the NFL GM, I know what I'm getting with Jonah Williams. A balanced blocker who has ability to play tackle on either side of the football, still athletic, still long, able to redirect in pass protection, and still learning on that left side exactly, where he needs to be. We saw some blunders there in the national championship game that Jonah has had the chance to clean up this year. So if he continues on that trajectory and looks even more comfortable at left tackle, I'd take Jonah Williams first because I think he's the better run blocker. I think he's the more balanced offensive lineman. I think he's the more versatile offensive linemen. But if I am a pass-happy team that is looking down the road, for instance, if I'm the New York Jets or the Arizona Cardinals or a team like the Cleveland Browns who has taken a quarterback recently, a highly drafted quarterback recently, and I'm looking at 5-10 years down the road at protecting his blind side, I may take Greg Little for the extended athleticism and potential ceiling that he has yet to hit physically. Because I'm playing for 2021, 2022. But if I'm a contender that feels he is a tackle or general offensive lineman away from a Super Bowl, let's say I'm Minnesota, New Orleans, somebody like that, I'm going Jonah Williams without hesitation because day one, he will be that much more ready to contribute, that much more ready to dominate, and that much more ready to move around if duty calls for that. So it's a good question. I think it's just like it was in recruiting. I think these guys will be 1 and 2 in that department in some way, shape, or form, and it will depend on what you need in the short term versus the long term. One more from Carl here. Good morning, John. If you had to choose between the Alabama roster as is and the Georgia roster as is, who would you choose and why? Thanks for answering my questions. It's still Alabama, and it's still Alabama by a fairly wide margin. I think talent-wise, not gelling or chemistry, talent-wise, the offensive line is very close in either direction. I think Georgia's has more chemistry, is more polished as a cohesive unit right now. But talent, left tackle to right tackle individually, I would probably still take Alabama's for the long haul. Quarterback, great situations at either school. Alabama was involved with every single quarterback that plays on both rosters during that recruiting process. But even still, the ceiling is with Tua. The ceiling is with Alabama. There's still a lot of unknown with Justin Fields at that level. And I think there's a certain peak that Jake Fromm can hit at that level as well. So I think the ceiling, the long-term status of Tua and Alabama, I think outweighs Georgia there. Running backs, they're both loaded stables. Alabama's more experienced, bigger, stronger. And there's more guys on that Alabama roster as well. Receiver, I don't think there's much of a comparison. I think Georgia is a bit weaker in that department and older. So if you think about that, if you think about the next couple of years, Bama really takes it. So offensively, it's definitely Alabama. And defensively, Georgia lost a lot from last year. They lost a lot from last year. But even still, at certain positions, Alabama is advanced. I think Alabama's defensive front, especially on early downs, when you're talking about Raekwon Davis, Quinnen Williams, Isaiah Buggs, this group is more advanced than that UGA group. Now, the Georgia group may be better pass rushers, so that is a bit of a wash when you're talking about the rosters there. Secondary, a lot of inexperience both ways. I think DeAndre Baker is the most experienced corner, but 2, 3, 4, and 5, I would lean towards Alabama, even with the inexperience there. Safety, Bama is ahead of Georgia as well. So almost across the board, Alabama's got the better roster. But if there is one position where it is undoubtedly Georgia, and there will not be one syllable, percentage of a word, decimal percentage even, of any word uttered in another direction, where Georgia is way, 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 way ahead of Alabama. It is kicker. It is Rodrigo Blankenship. That dude is a missile. That dude is a weapon. That dude will be drafted among the highest drafted kickers in the last 5 years. He's an animal. Remember the national championship game? Jake Fromm sacked on 3rd down. Terrell Lewis putting his hands in the air. No worries for Rodrigo Blankenship. Rec specs on, boot ready, kick good. That dude can absolutely fire a football with his right foot, and that is the one position where there is not even a debate. There is not even the foundation of a debate right now as to which roster is better in that department, Georgia versus Alabama. So Georgia takes the cake there overwhelmingly, but really not overwhelmingly anywhere else over Alabama, at least from where I sit at this point. Linebacker's one that I'd like to revisit. I need to watch Georgia a little bit more to answer that question. The Roquan Smith group last year, definitely well ahead of Bama's group this year, but Roquan's gone. I hadn't really seen a lot of Georgia. They blew out South Carolina, and I changed the channel, to be honest with you. One more question via Twitter from Luke Ferguson. John, who are the recruits you feel you know the most about and have seen the most of recently? This is a good question, Luke. I think you got to go to the state of Alabama. I think you got to go to the top prospects in that state, whether they're committed or otherwise. I think you go to Pierce Quick, you go to Paul Tyson, you go to Talia Tagovailoa, George Pickens, Bo Nix. These are the guys that I've been around most. Clay Webb. These are the guys that we've covered the longest. They've been good for a long time. So you got to go to that Birmingham area for the kids that I'm most familiar with at this point. But in terms of the ones I've seen most recently, we're very fortunate to have been to the opening finals where we saw all of the best prospects in the country. We've spent a lot of time in Georgia, Alabama, and Florida in terms of watching high school practices and games thus far in the season, although this damn rain in Florida has killed my last 2 Friday nights, and I'm hoping tonight is not the case. But we've been able to see a lot of top prospects all over the South since the opening, since the summer came to a conclusion. So it's a pretty wide list, but over the long haul, Luke, it's those Birmingham kids. Those are kind of the home team for me. A lot of them committed to Bama, a lot of them committed to Auburn, some of them still uncommitted. Those are the ones that I'm most comfortable discussing. But where it's that time of year where we're learning every day. We're going out every day trying to find new talent and get fresh looks at guys. My opinion of Trey Sanders 2 years ago when we first started covering him versus today is very, very different. So I think you have to go back to the well sometimes, not only for an update on the recruitments, but for an update on their game and their progress and how much they've put on. Are they putting on good weight? All these things that make that part of my job probably the most fun part of it, just besides interacting with you guys, of course. And then the final question of the pod coming via email. Our buddy Dylan Britt hits at cabcpod@gmail.com for those who want to jump in and do the same. He says, hey guys, been a little bit since I submitted a question. After watching both Louisville and Arkansas State games, I have come away very disappointed in Mack Wilson. I had such high hopes for him going into the season, but he looks lost out there. I think he is overthinking everything. We know he is capable of being an All-American, but don't know if he should be calling plays. What do y'all think about Dylan Moses taking over the play calling? I think Dylan might have a better grasp of the defense, even though he has been there fewer years. Thanks, Dylan Britt, Roll Tide. This is interesting. Well, there's a two parts to your question there, Dylan. First, I think there's no doubt that it has not been smooth sailing for either linebacker. I'm not going to put Mack versus Dylan here, but there's no doubt that there has not been 100% smooth sailing for either guy. So with Mack, it is perhaps mental and physical, and with Dylan, as far as we know, it is just physical at this point. But you have to look at it from a couple of different angles. One, there's not a lot of experience behind these two, so I'm glad you're not calling for anybody's job. We don't know how much has truly been put on Mack. Saban called him out, at SEC Media Days, and kind of bestowed the title of signal caller upon him, but we don't know how much he's truly doing. That's something you'd have to ask Mack, and I believe Mack, who is a team guy, will downplay that. I think he will downplay how much responsibility he has and or how much that responsibility has affected his ability to read and react on the football field. So I don't think we'd get a lot of good answers there if we did speak to Mack. But we don't really know how much it's affecting him. Is he trying to get guys lined up to the point where it's costing him, his alignment, his responsibility, how comfortable he feels, how fast of a flow he can make? Perhaps he is. Perhaps he is overthinking it to some degree. There were rumors and chatter about an injury that he has been dealing with. Kirk talked about it on Monday. Is that factoring into maybe the lack of flashing that Mack is doing compared to years and months past? Could all of these things be a factor together with Mac? Could he be, just a little behind in general, independent of those factors? Remember, Mac has played a lot of football in spots for this Alabama defense. But in terms of every play, 3 downs, he's the guy, no subs. This is still the beginning of that. So I think that's part of it as well. So I don't think you bail on him as a signal caller just yet, especially because Moses, who's been really good, and it's probably been a little bit better head-to-head, but it hasn't been, 1, a huge gap, and 2, he's had some of the same errors from what we can tell. And I caution everybody, from what we can tell, we're not in the huddle. I don't know every play call, so we don't know every element of the responsibility of every play. So a perceived miss from either guy is that it's perceived. So from where we sit, it looks like Dylan has had some of the same issues that Mac has had. Now, again, I think they're more mental with Dylan. It's been more seemingly zone dropping related, pass coverage related. But at the same time, we've seen Nick expand Dylan's role from the jump. We've seen Dylan rush the passer a little bit more from the outside and inside. He's been excellent on green dog blitzes where his assignment stays in and blocks, which gives him the green light, the green dog opportunity to rush the passer or blitz. He's been great in those elements, and we all know Dylan can run. Dylan can flat out run, so his ability to play in space has shined, especially against runners. But he's had some blunders in the passing game as well. His eyes have been caught in the backfield a couple of times, just like Mac's have. So I don't think the gap between Mac and Dylan one way or the other has been enough to justify a complete overhaul in the communication process. Not just yet. Again, Ole Miss is going to be a test for this back 7. They will throw the football whether they're up, whether they're down, whether they're down 50. They're going to throw the football. They've got big, strong wide receivers who can not only go versatile and hurt the DBs in 50-50 chances, but they're going to go across the middle as well. So I think that's where you see these guys somewhat vulnerable. I think a lot of the success that each opposing quarterback has had, whether it's Arkansas State or Louisville, has come across the middle, has come against that underneath zone for the linebackers and or safeties. So I think Ole Miss will try at some point to exploit that, just like the other 2 teams have through the first 2 weeks. So Dylan and Mac should be prepared for that, and obviously I assume that they will be prepared for that. So I think we need to identify the issue with Mac first. Is it physical? Is it mental? Is it communication? Is it overthinking? And let a few more games play out before anything drastic like that goes down, because it might not seem like a big deal, but that is a drastic change on a defense. The guy who is the center of communication, when you're in a conference room, on a conference call at work, you got that big speakerphone in the middle that has all the different channels and everybody's kind of leaned in towards that. That guy on the football field is the play caller. It's Mac Wilson right now. Changing that is a big deal. It's a big deal in practice. It's a big deal in implementation. It's a big deal in game planning. And obviously it's a big deal on Saturday afternoons or evenings in this case. So I think it's a little early for that, Dylan, but it is something to keep an eye on. It is something that you're tracking. It is something that we're tracking, and something I'm very eager to see in the game within the game Saturday night when Alabama heads over to Oxford, Mississippi to take on those high-flying Rebels or Black Bears or Land Sharks or Fighting Hugh Freezes, whatever they're called these days. It's going to be a long night for that back 7. I would say independent of the scoreboard, it's going to be a long, busy, hectic night. And again, as we talked about with Ben Garrett, what makes it even harder for Mac and Dylan and these linebackers is that now Ole Miss has a game-breaking running back. They have a shifty, elusive, somewhat powerful running back to complement all of the aerial fireworks. So that is what makes it different. Jordan Wilkins was a good back. Good, solid back. But he wasn't a guy that you had to identify pre-snap every single time. No disrespect. He's in the NFL, for goodness sake. So what does he care what I think? But this Scotty Phillips is different. He is different. He is smaller. He is more compact, more elusive, lower body dominant. So I think he's harder to cover. He's harder to deal with in this spread element, which is obviously the niche of what Ole Miss does. So I think he's going to be a factor as well. So if he's keeping the linebackers up just that much longer, the windows are that much wider for Jordan Ta'amu and A.J. Brown and DK Metcalf and all of these excellent wide receivers that Ole Miss has on the roster. But certainly something to keep an eye on. Dylan will be watching that very closely Saturday evening, and hopefully we'll have more Monday on the next Crimson and Blue Chips, or perhaps a live weekend edition. We had such a successful accidental live stream midweek that we may fire that thing up again sometime this weekend. So again, follow us on Twitter at CABC Pod and get all of the most relevant information if you would like to be in communication with us. And maybe we'll have even more supplemental content, live streams. We interviewed #Coach Syrup last night, Thursday night. It was awesome. Please check that out. It has nothing to do with Alabama, but as football fans and for Kev, producer Kev, as an O-line guy, pretty much a match made in heaven. So check out all of our content. We're expanding much, much more headed your way unconventionally, not just this podcast, although this, of course, remains our foundation. So check us out on YouTube as well. But that'll do it for today, and that'll do it for this week on Crimson and Blue Chips. Thanks for listening, everybody. Thank you for all the questions submitted, and we'll see what happens on Saturday. God bless. Garcia out.